Today, in my match fishing memories, I want to go back almost 40 years to one of the Barclays Championships. The way they worked was that on the second Wednesday in October, there would be an annual match, which was, at the time we're talking, around about 200 pegs, around about 33 teams of 6, with a few stewards' pegs as well. They'd fish sort of start half an hour later and finish half an hour early, and then weigh everyone in and organise everything. And like I say, the match would be on a Wednesday. It had to wait until October because a lot of the people who fished in this match were staff of Barclays branches, and they had end of 6-month period, the end of September, when they couldn't get time off. So 10 days later they could usually get time off, no problems. The day before, the Tuesday, a lot of anglers would travel to the venue, stay overnight, and the AGM of the association, the Barclays Bank Association, would take place on the Tuesday evening before the match the next day. And then after the match the next day, there would be a presentation of the prizes for the winners of the match. Back in 1982, I can't remember exactly where we fished, but we fished the match, and I remember one of our anglers, Neil Maidment, standing up at the AGM at the point where they asked for suggestions for the venue for the following year. Before we could stop him, he'd said nothing to the rest of us who were there, the sort of regulars from Poole. He'd suggested that the Dorset Stour in the sort of Bournemouth area, Christchurch up through to sort of Longham, would be a perfect venue. And I can remember glancing at a couple of our other anglers in our team there in horror, and Neil sold it very well. He talked of barbel and 4-pound chub and roach and dace, all of which were true, that the Stour had these fish in it. What it didn't have, or what would be a problem, was that to get 200 pegs on the river in early October would be very, very difficult. There were winter leagues held on the Stour every year, and they were mostly 120 pegs. But that's a big step from 120 to 200. And when it was 120 pegs, Christchurch Angling Club would use all of their water on the lower Stour, so a stretch at Longham, and then the entire tidal fishery. And sometimes they would even borrow sort of 10 pegs on the very bottom end of Throop fishery by arrangement either with Ringwood Club or Throop fishery itself, which was a separate entity back in those days. Now Neil was confident that he could get the cooperation of the local clubs of Ringwood and Christchurch, and possibly even Wimborne, because Wimborne also used to run a winter league, and they did 120 pegs a little bit later in the year. The problem that was coming up was that in early October the Stour was likely to be still quite weedy. The weed had died back in August, as it does every year, but until you've had some good floods through, which is normally about the middle of November, a lot of it is very difficult to peg. You just get whole lengths, especially places like Longham or parts of Throop, that are still very, very weedy, and it's not really fair to peg people on what are basically unfishable swims. Down on the tidal wasn't so bad, but we were sort of wary or gobsmacked, whatever you want to say. And we said afterwards, we're a bit concerned. Oh, it'll be okay, said Neil. So, okay. One thing in its favour for having a match in our area was that we all worked in a huge office in Poole that had a capacity of about 3,000 people. It had, or still has, a multi-storey car park with over 1,000 spaces. And of course in the day that's used by all the people working there, but there was a big, or might have even been 2 big staff restaurants that we could use for the AGM the night before and for the prize presentation. And because we would be out of office hours, we'd be able to use the car park as well, especially as the AGM wouldn't be till sort of 7 o'clock in the evening, and it even had a licensed bar as well. And there wouldn't be any problem in using those facilities, so that was an upside to it all. Anyway, we all forgot about this for 10 months, and the following year, in the August 1983, Neil started to talk to Christchurch Club and Ringwood Club and say, I need 200 pegs, a good 200 pegs, because like I say, with the stewards and everything else. And I think we were scheduled to have 33 teams of 6, plus let's say a few stewards as well. And at this point, Christchurch and Ringwood pushed back. They said, no can do, you're just not going to do it. We'd have every single bit of our water closed. You're still going to struggle for pegs. You're going to have going to be short by quite a few. We have an alternative for you, which is we can offer you some of the gravel pits around Ringwood as waters. It's going to be tight, but it can be done. Hightown Lake, which still had water skiers back then, the housing estate that's on there by the side of it had yet to be built. The water had yet to be sold, still belonged to the gravel company, had about 70 pegs. That meant that we could just about squeeze in 2 sections of 33 and a couple of stewards with nothing to spare. Nowadays, if you were to go there, you'd say, how on earth would you do that? Because in the 40 years since then, massive trees have grown all around the banks, and quite often the swims are spaced out far more than they are now. So that was 2 sections. The Roach pit would cope with 1 section, and again that was sold off by the gravel company quite a few years ago now, a syndicate Carp Water, but back then it contained roach, not much else, just roach. The other lake would be Meadow Lake. This was before what was known as Vincent's was dug, and then there was another lake called Kings, and those eventually combined. But Meadow Lake again had fairly open, clear banks all the way round, and Neil worked out that he would be able to squeeze in pretty much 100 pegs on there, which, like I say, I don't know how many you'd get around there nowadays. It's now syndicate, and probably a lot less than 100, maybe 30 or 40. And that had a few carp, some tench, quite a few small roach. There weren't bream in there then. I don't think there were rudd in there. There weren't pike. There may have been crucians in there. In fact, I'd say there definitely were crucians in there, and tench, possibly some perch. So on that basis, Neil had a venue, and he then had to break the news to all the region and say, sorry, the Stour's just not going to be fishable enough. We're not going to get the swims. Please accept my apologies. This is what we're going to do. We're going to have the AGM at Barclays House in Poole the night before, and the match will be on these pits. I think of those, only Meadow Lake had day tickets in those days. I think it still had day tickets, and he said people could get day tickets on there, but the others were club only waters. At this point, maybe a month before the match was due, Neil said we got together as a team what we needed to do to organise it, and the way the match worked was the draw was done the night before at the AGM, and teams were allowed to allocate their anglers to their pegs. You didn't have to just have a totally random draw. You'd get a number like peg 1, and then you could say, you can, to one angler you can go to A1, another B1, C1, D1, so on. So what Neil said, he said, I want to fish Meadow Lake. He obviously fancied his chances of winning on there, which was fair enough. The rest of us weren't too bothered. I knew a little bit about Hightown. I'd fished it a bit over the previous few years, and the word was it wasn't too bad. Quite a few roach in there, skimmers, little perch. That was about it. Nowadays people fish for the carp in there, and there are still some big bream. There used to be some good tension there. I don't know if they're there now, but back in those days it was basically roach and skimmers with the odd slightly bigger bream, and we're not talking big, but up to a couple of pounds. So myself and Glenn, one of the other anglers, said, yeah, we're okay with Hightown. We know what to do. We know we'll go there and fish it, make sure we've sorted out the pegging. A guy called Terry Ball, he was happy to fish the roach pit, and the other 3 anglers, Neil included, would fish on meadow. And we were all okay with that. So myself and Glenn decided to practice on Hightown. So I probably hadn't fished it for 2 or 3 years. And Glenn actually had several days off the week before to fish it. And on the Friday night I caught up with him because I was working that week, and I said, okay, I'll come and meet you up there on the Saturday and I'll have a fish myself. And Glenn had between sort of 5 and 7 pounds some days, and it was obvious that red maggots and red pinkies with a red ground bait that used to be in vogue in those days, pure sang, seemed to produce quite a few skimmers, not many, a few roach. And I fished it on the long pole on the Saturday and had about 18 pounds, and I thought, well, I'm pretty confident of this. Of course there's no match on, there's no disturbance at all, and being a gravel pit, the crunching would be quite bad on there, could disturb it, make it much harder, and it was obvious that it would be good for fishing. Come the match on the Wednesday, it was quite windy. There was a good southwesterly blowing and it was quite mild. I don't think it rained, but it was pretty grey and overcast, and a good strength wind, sort of a force 5 or 6. We'd drawn end peg, which was peg 33. And because we drew the night before and I hadn't pegged it till the morning, I could decide which way round to peg it. I had sort of 2 sections to put in. Do I start from, there was a ski club and you had to start either side of that. There was a sort of bay where the ski club was. We couldn't peg in front of there, didn't want to peg anywhere near them. We either started on the point of the annex and went round sort of D1 to 33 and then E1 to 33, or we started at the other end and started at the end of the ski jump bank, as it was, which is the stream bank on there. So I thought, well, logically we may as well start on the point of the annex. That would mean either way we would end up with a peg somewhere near the railway bank car park. Didn't matter which way we went, we'd end up in that area, and the end peg would either be the annex point or up past the ski jump, which would mean that I'd have a load, or we'd have a load of empty bank beyond that because of the sort of bushes in the water. It wasn't peggable the last sort of 50 yards or 100 yards or so. So that's what we did. We pegged it starting from the annex all the way around, and that gave me basically an end peg, and Glenn was sort of on this middle peg, and somewhere we squeezed in a couple of steward's pegs. Can't quite remember where they went, but we used 68 pegs on there. come the start of the match, I'd drawn next to a very experienced angler, one who'd fished in our Barclays national team, and I wanted to, what should we say, totally stop the threat of him competing for my fish. So I told a little white lie, and he asked me what to expect, and I said, oh, roach on a waggler, bronze maggot. What I really wanted to do was to feed 2 swims. One would be about, it was too windy for a long pole, and the poles back then weren't especially good, or the one I had wasn't that good. It was a carbon pole, but fish about 3 rod lengths out with this ground bait, soft ground bait with pinkies, and fish a waggler there, but also feed a swim about 30 yards out that I was going to fish with a little ground bait feeder and pinkies on a 22 on a sort of 3-foot tail. And to feed that swim I was going to put soft balls of ground bait out with a whopper dropper. Not very big balls, but they'd be lost in the waves where it was windy. So at the start of the match, I started on bronze maggot on a waggler, just like I told this guy. And after about 20 minutes, I started to put the ground bait out, and I also put some in on this inner line, and he wasn't noticing that. He was just loose feeding. I got a roach after 20 minutes. I got a roach 2 or 3 ounces. I didn't get many roach in that match, and he said, what do you get that on? I said, oh, bronze maggot. Like I said, a roach, they should come on. And of course the ground bait starting to work, and that ground bait was really essential for the skimmers. And I started to catch these skimmers only like this on the inside, and all the time I'm putting this feed out there. So after 2 hours I've got getting on for £1 of little skimmers really, and this roach. I then went out on the tip, still on the old Roy Marlowe persuader. I don't know if possibly on a butt indicator because of the wind. They were quite handy for that sort of fishing. And this angler next to me is not really noticing what I'm up to. And of course I put this bait out there, but he's not catching. He's not putting any ground bait in anywhere, just loose feeding, and the skimmers won't turn onto that. He's not getting any roach. I think he's had a little perch. And I start to get more skimmers out on the feeder line. At the same time, continuing to feed ground bait close in. And after, I suppose, about 3 hours, I've probably got about £3 at skimmers, up to maybe 1 or 2 better ones, maybe £1. And the angler on the next peg then decides to go out. But of course he's got no bait out there, and I've drawn the fish in. I then come in onto a swim that I've been feeding with ground bait, and I get some more skimmers on the waggler. By now I was getting confused. After a little while he comes in, so I go out again and get more skimmers. Probably the best fish of the match, about £1.50 for me. And with maybe half an hour to go, Dave Swallow turned up. He was our local tackle dealer. I don't know if he lived quite close to there in Ringwood in Powner. He certainly had the tackle shop in Bournemouth, what is now Bournemouth Fishing Lodge. May have even been running a tackle shop in Ringwood. I can't remember, it was a long time ago, but he was local and he knew about this match being on, so I'd spoken to him. And Dave said to me, he said, how you doing, Mark? I said, I'm doing well. I got about £5. He said, well, no one's caught anything. I've been right round Meadow Lake and the roach pit, next to nothing being caught. He said, there's a few fish on this lake, but not much. If you got £5, you've got a chance of winning. And not long after that, the match finished. The poor guy next to me had one little perch, and I still feel sorry for him. He's still around. And I'm not going to say his name because that's not very kind. We weighed in our lake. Glenn had done reasonable. He'd had a pain, which doesn't say much, but he was fourth in his section of 33. There was a couple of pound had won his section. My section, I'd got 5.12, won the section easily. There was another weight, quite a reasonable weight, about £3. In my section, one or two £2. So I was probably in the best section of the match. Meadow Lake had been disastrous. Neil had just a couple of ounces and was very high up in his section, and it was the same story for the other two anglers on that lake. They only caught an ounce or two, but they were right up in the top 4 or 5 of their sections. Well, and like I say, that's 5 good ones. Neil had lost a big carp, which would have won him the match. He probably gambled that if he could get one big fish, he could win. It wasn't to be. And Terry had caught 12 ounces and come second in his section on the roach pit. Well, if you've got 6 anglers and no one's lower than about 6th in your section, and then you've got first and seconds in the section, and bear in mind there were quite a few blanks in different places, not so much on Hightown, but the roach pit was pretty bad and there were lots of blanks on Meadow. We were looking pretty good. We even had the Stewards Cup, so I'd won the match overall with 5.12. There was a £4 was second off Meadow, down to about £3 and £2. And when we looked at the results every which way, we absolutely walked it on points. If we'd done it on weight, we'd have still walked it. We had about £8 odd, and we were still £4 clear on weight. So it was an almost embarrassment of riches. We'd won the Stewards Cup. Suffice to say, it was the last time anyone asked us to run that match again, and we'd done very, very well. That's it for now, and until next time, it's goodbye.